Content note: this account describes ritualized violence and may be disturbing to some viewers. He strips her of the bracelets and anklets, and she hands them to the old woman standing by the ship. The air over the Volga that day is thick with smoke and the smell of tallow. Men drum soft patterns on shields to keep their voices low. A ship waits half ashore like a dark animal, its prow carved and its timbers laid over a pyre. Ahmad ibn Fadlan, a scholar-diplomat from Baghdad, on a mission far from home, records every precise movement with the blunt awe of an outsider. He writes what he sees. A young slave woman, clearly singled out from among others, performed as if honored, washed and dressed in fine cloth, yet being prepared to leave the living world to accompany a dead chieftain. He notes the kindnesses and the cruelties in the same paragraph. He notes the repetition of words spoken to the corpse, and he notes the beating of shields to mute screams. That single scene, observed on the banks of a river in 921, became the linchpin for a larger, troubling picture, a practice that historians now summarize, with careful qualifiers, as the ritual passing of a woman before the fire. Ibn Fadlan's account matters because it is unusually direct. He is not a Norseman, nor a romantic teller of Viking tales. He is a learned envoy from the Abbasid court who describes a people whose customs confounded him. Traveling north to the lands of the Volga Bulgars and encountering the group called the Rus, he records matters of trade and diplomacy, but he lingers on what he cannot easily set alongside his own cultural assumptions. He writes like an observer who wants his reader to understand exactly what he saw, the order of actions, the participants, the words used, the objects exchanged. For historians, that kind of eyewitness detail is rare, and the visceral nature of his report, the juxtaposition of ceremony and violence, forces historians to reckon with questions that archaeological bones alone cannot answer. We will spend time with Ibn Fadlan's paragraphs because they are the narrative spine of this ritual. But his testimony cannot stand alone. It must be set against the wider beliefs and social structures that made such a thing conceivable, and against the physical traces left in the earth by graves and burial mounds. Only by holding both the inked witness and the skeletal remains side by side can we begin to understand what is meant by the phrase at the heart of our title, passing her around before the fire. If you want more deep dives into real history like this, subscribe and turn on notifications. There are more stories where this one came from. To make sense of what you're about to hear, we need a map of belief and power. Across much of Scandinavia and among groups who sailed out from its coasts in the 9th and 10th centuries, death was not conceived as a single solitary disappearance. Instead, it was a transition through which the social identity of a person, his or her status, possessions, and attendance had to be preserved. Grave goods, horses, weapons, and even household objects appear in funerary contexts because the dead were expected to require them. A ship could serve as a vehicle for the journey to the afterlife, a household in miniature, or a stage showing who that person had been in life. In such cosmologies, the worth of a chieftain was measured not only by land or tribute, but by the size and splendor of the display that accompanied his burial. Slavery, in this setting, had specific social meanings. Slaves were property and labor, yes, but they were also embedded into the logic of household reproduction. They could be traded, inherited, or offered as pledges. Their bodies and labors underwrote the visible wealth of elites. That structural reality, the disposability of certain lives within a societal hierarchy, is the necessary context for ritual acts that demand human attendance for the dead. When a burial calls for companions, it is the social inequality of the living that furnishes them. But belief and social structure alone do not tell us why a particular slave woman would be chosen to accompany a chieftain. Ibn Fadlan reports that a slave girl was singled out and treated for 10 days as though she were a person of rank, given fine clothing, attended by 2 servant girls, offered alcohol, and, crucially, passed from tent to tent each night. In his pages, the rhythm of those nights becomes a ritual text in itself. Each man who took her into his tent would, according to the account, recite a set phrase as the act concluded. The formula, repeatedly rendered in modern retellings as something like, "Tell your master I did this out of love for him," served simultaneously as a declaration to the dead, a rite of communication that reaffirmed bonds, and a public performance that testified to the chieftain's power and the willingness of his household to furnish him companions beyond the grave. How should we approach that formula? One reading is that it functions primarily as a ritualized message to the deceased, a way for the living to tell the chieftain, in the presence of his people and gods, that his household remains intact and obedient. Another reading is that the repetition of these words made the act legible as a gift, an act of service performed in the name of duty or honor rather than simple brutality. A third, darker interpretation is that the formula was a ritual mechanism that helped to normalize the acts among the participants. If men utter words framed as devotion, the violence that follows becomes integrated into a cultural script that limits moral dissonance. All of these readings are possible. None can be proven beyond doubt from a single narrative. It is essential to label them as hypotheses, interpretations that bring meaning but do not by themselves supply absolute truth. Ibn Fadlan's own perspective is complicated. He does not approach the scene as a neutral ethnographer in the modern sense, and yet his reactions are plain. He is startled and horrified by aspects of the ritual, and he tells his readers so. He records details that a dispassionate trader might ignore, the way the girl was anointed, the music played to hush the crowd, the specific people present, and the sequence by which they joined the rites. That careful chronicling is why his account has been read and reread by scholars, but it is precisely because he is an outsider that his observations must be handled with methodological caution. He reports not only what he saw, but what his informants told him about meanings and expectations. Distinguishing between the two is part of the task. What about the woman herself? Ibn Fadlan does not give her a name. Her youth is evident in his tone and in the fact that servants attend her. Any precise age is unknown and should not be invented. Some modern scholars infer she may have been quite young, but that is an inference, not a fact recorded in the text. His account places her actions and comportment on the public stage. She is washed, dressed, offered the trappings of rank, and then presented for the nightly passing. She participates in the ceremonial life of the household for 10 days. She is treated with a mixture of reverence and instrumentalization. Any attempt to narrate her interior life, her private thoughts, motivations, or feelings would be speculation beyond the sources. Instead, we must attend to what was done to her and what was done around her, and then ask what systems of belief and power permitted those acts. The 10-day sequence is striking in its duality. On one hand, she is honored, new clothes, ornaments, attendants, and place settings. On the other, she becomes an object of ritual circulation. Each night, she is led to a different tent, where a man lies with her and repeats the formula to the chieftain. This nightly passage is not, by Ibn Fadlan's account, a secret act concealed from the household. It is staged and public, a ritual performance with a clear script. Modern readers find that oscillation, the visible respect accorded to a person simultaneously being prepared for death, profoundly disquieting. It is worth pausing to consider why the act is staged over 10 days rather than performed quickly or in secrecy. One plausible explanation is that the extended timeline magnifies the social effect. A prolonged period of honor heightens the spectacle of sacrifice and gives the household time to enact the required deeds of provision, from slaughtering animals to arranging ship and pyre. Another is that the prolonged indulgence serves to deepen the ritual states of those involved. Feasting, intoxication, and repetitive rites can move people toward trance-like experiences in which visions and authoritative declarations become more likely. Ibn Fadlan describes a kind of ritual economy where speech and display stand in for other forms of exchange. The repeated phrase functions as both message and proof. Each man's declaration is testimony that he participated in the required offering. It is an audible ledger entry that will travel with the chieftain into memory and the living believed into the afterlife. The rhetorical force of the formula cannot be divorced from the social pressure to conform. Failing to be seen making that declaration would be a shame to the household and a diminishment of the chieftain's prestige. One must remember that the acts are embedded in an honor culture where public evidence of loyalty and service mattered as much as material goods. Alcohol and ritual song weave through Ibn Fadlan's account. He notes feasting and an atmosphere where inhibitions loosen. It is reasonable and cautious to suggest that intoxicants, music, and the repetitive nature of the nightly rites could have produced altered states in participants. Those states might explain reports of visions or ecstatic utterances in doorway ceremonies, which he also records. But explain does not mean explain away. Vision reports, whether pharmaceutically induced or culturally taught, carry meaning within that belief system. They validate the ritual, provide a narrative of passage, and shape communal memory. This brings us to one of the most enigmatic moments in the 10-day sequence, the doorway rite. According to Ibn Fadlan, at the threshold between the tent and the world, the young woman is lifted as if to cross a boundary, and she speaks of what she sees beyond. Those utterances are recorded as part of the ritual script. In the words of those who performed the rite, what she reports is interpreted as evidence that the chieftain's household will be provided for in the next world, that the proper arrangements have been made, and that the dead man's status will be affirmed. For modern analysts, a range of interpretive options opens. The doorway could be a literal liminal staging, the lifting an enactment meant to simulate transition, and the woman's utterances could be the product of suggestion, ecstasy, or carefully taught responses. It is also possible and historically plausible that those utterances were read into by the ritual specialists present. That is, the audience and the officiants shaped the narrative of what she saw to suit communal expectations. One figure in Ibn Fadlan's telling stands out in particular, an elderly woman whom he and his informants refer to as an angel of death, a ritual specialist of advanced age who appears to hold both practical and symbolic authority in the rites. She is described as someone who supervises the proceedings, who knows the formulas, and who performs the final coercive steps when necessary. Her existence in the account complicates simple readings of the ritual as purely masculine domination. There are women in the ritual hierarchy who hold specialized roles and who execute aspects of the ceremony that men cannot or will not do. The angel of death functions as a bridge between the household and the sacred economy of sacrifice. Her presence indicates that this is not a random crime, but a ritually organized sequence with specified roles and invoked legitimacy. Throughout his description, Ibn Fadlan is attentive to sound. When the moment of execution approaches, he notes that men beat shields to drown out any cries. The shield beating is an audible technology of control. It allows the community to keep its ceremonial poise while masking the immediate experience of the victim from those who must maintain order. This detail is blunt and chilling. It indicates a conscious effort to manage the public face of the ritual in ways that protect social cohesion and the ritual's symbolic integrity. It also shows the lengths to which a community would go to contain moral dissonance, to keep the act within the ritual bounds and out of plain sensory horror for as many of the participants as possible. We should pause again to register the limits of what the account can tell us. Ibn Fadlan observes actions. He reports words. He tells us the sequence. He does not provide the inner motives of participants beyond what they verbally express. He does not name the young woman. Archaeology will later provide corroborating and complicating evidence. Graves where female skeletons lie beside male elites, signs on bones consistent with violent death, and a pattern of high-status burials accompanied by human remains in certain contexts. But such archaeological confirmation cannot automatically validate every detail of a single narrative. Instead, it creates a conversation between text and soil. Where the text reports a ritual, the soil sometimes shows a parallel practice. Where the soil shows unusual deposition, texts like Ibn Fadlan's supply a plausible interpretive frame. Each informs the other, and each must be treated with evidentiary caution. As the 10 days draw to a close in Ibn Fadlan's report, the atmosphere tightens. The display of honor becomes acceleration toward an ending that the community has rehearsed. Jewelry is offered, blessings are murmured, and every event moves the household closer to the pyre. The girl is resplendent. She is circled by attendants. The men who have been told to declare their devotion have done so publicly. The ship is prepared. Observers, the living, the emissaries, the ritual specialists, line up to perform their roles. Some in the crowd stand in silence, others drink to blunt feeling. The narrative energy in the account builds toward the threshold point we have been approaching, the last ceremony, the entrance to the tent, and the closing of the ritual that will render the chieftain's household completed. It is at this juncture that the ambiguity of agency, consent, and coercion becomes most acute. Ibn Fadlan reports that the girl hesitated at the entrance to the tent. He reports that the angel of death forced her inside. These are observations, not moral pronouncements. From that moment, the account shifts into a different register. The ritual is no longer about accolade and provision, but about a literal crossing, the extinguishing of a human life as part of a larger cosmological and social logic. To read this passage without horror is difficult. To read it without trying to explain it is irresponsible. Multiple factors converge here. Institutional structures that allowed slavery to supply sacrificial goods, beliefs that required attendance in the afterlife, ritual specialists who could authorize extreme acts, and the community mechanisms, feasting, speech, shield beating, that softened the human perception of what was being done. We stop short of recounting the final interior moments of that tent, because the sources demand precision. Ibn Fadlan gives a sequence: shield beating, the presence of 6 men, the intervention of the older ritualist. And that sequence is what we must preserve. But the inner sounds and sensations, the private agony, and any speculative interiority belong to areas of sharpest ethical caution. The texts and the bones together will permit us to approach the mechanics of death, the physical traces left behind, and the social aftermath. For now, the story hangs at an unbearable threshold. A public performance of honor turning, finally and inexorably, into the performance of an ending, all observed and recorded by a man from a different world, and later echoed in the earth itself. Ibn Fadlan's sequence does not end with ritual words or lifted hands. It culminates in a set of coordinated acts that he describes with the blunt focus of an eyewitness. After the hesitation at the tent flap, after the force applied by the old woman, the informants called the Angel of Death, the community moves to complete the work it has staged for 10 days. He reports men beating shields outside, while the crucial actions happen within. He notes the presence of 6 named male relatives tasked with entering the tent. He records the rope and the knife, and he watches as the body, first the chieftain, then the woman chosen to accompany him, is placed on the ship and the pyre is prepared. These facts form an implicative chain: selection, protracted preparation, validated declarations, threshold performance, and violent ending, followed by the ship's conflagration. To linger on each of these elements is not to sensationalize, but to reconstruct, as precisely as the sources allow, how ritual, power and practical mechanics interlock that day on the Volga. When the tent closes, the shield beating outside is not incidental. Ibn Fadlan stresses it, and archaeologists and historians read it as a calculated means of control. Sound, in ritual contexts, serves many functions. It unifies a crowd, signals transitions, calls attention to events and, when used as masking, creates a barrier between sensory immediacy and communal interpretation. To beat the shields, to drown screams, is to manage the community's sensory field, so that the ritual can be perceived not as an atrocity, but as the successful completion of a cosmological act. It insulates participants from the immediate cries of pain and allows the larger narrative of providing for the dead, of preserving honor, to prevail. Sound thus operates as a cultural technology in the orchestration of sacrifice. Inside the tent, according to the account, 6 men take part in the physical act that ends the girl's life. Ibn Fadlan records rope and a dagger. Later commentators have discussed the combination of methods as both practical and ritualized. Strangulation or asphyxiation by rope to silence the body and ensure death, and a knife used to make certain by producing a fatal wound. The angel of death is described as supervising and sometimes taking the final act herself. This duality, male hands performing part of the mechanics, an older female specialist authorizing or executing the final gesture, complicates simple narratives of gendered perpetration. The ritual is not simply a masculine violence. It is a structured ceremony with assigned roles, some of which are held by women who steward the ritual's correct unfolding. Describing method without lurid detail is a narrow path. Ibn Fadlan's matter-of-fact lines leave little room for imaginative reconstruction of pain or dread. They provide instead a procedural account. He names objects, participants, and sequences. From a methodological standpoint, historians must adhere to that procedural register. We can discuss rope, dagger, and shield beating in sobriety. We can discuss intention and social logic in analytical terms. But we must not invent the private sensations of those inside. That restraint is both an ethical and scholarly necessity. Once the deaths are complete, Ibn Fadlan watches the placement and burning. The chieftain's body is laid out, his valuables arranged, and the woman who died to accompany him is placed beside him. The ship, already half ashore and prepared as a pyre, becomes a symbolic and practical vehicle for transit. Fire, in many funerary systems, functions both to transform and to release. In the Norse ritual imagination, burning the ship could mean sending the household across a liminal threshold, ensuring passage through flames to the world beyond, or simply rendering an elaborate show of finality. The household's world ends not in ordinary earth, but in a spectacle of destruction and transition. For those who made and witnessed the rite, the burning was a communal punctuation mark. Ibn Fadlan's description of the pyre's lighting is embedded in the sensory palette of the wider scene. Smoke rising, timbers cracking, the smell of burning pitch and tallow. In that combustible theatre, the household's status is made manifest through the scale of the ship, the quantity of goods, the ritual choreography that preceded the end. The visual of a ship consumed by flame with bodies and goods atop it is haunting. It is also an enactment of cosmology. The journey to the other world begins with incineration, and the material goods are either destroyed as offerings or transformed into smoke and memory. From a historian's vantage, the rhetorical power of Ibn Fadlan's eyewitness lines rests in their convergence with other forms of evidence. Texts alone can be idiosyncratic. Soils and bones alone are mute on certain meanings. When archaeologists excavate high-status graves across Scandinavia and in regions where Norse groups settled or traveled, some of which include ship burials, multiple burials grouped by gender and status, or graves containing both human and animal remains, They provide material contexts that either corroborate or complicate the picture, Ibn Fadlan's sketches. The classic comparative example is the Oseberg ship burial in Norway, a richly furnished ship grave containing 2 women, a profusion of textiles, woodwork, and domestic goods. Oseberg is not a sacrificial scene like the Volga account. Its interpretation has shifted over generations of scholarship, and the presence of women does not by itself indicate sacrifice. Yet Oseberg demonstrates how ships functioned as funerary architecture, and how female burials could be integrated into high-status mortuary display. Other sites come closer to the model Ibn Fadlan described. Excavations at Birka, an important trading center in present-day Sweden, revealed burials that once appeared to include women laid beside men. Interpretations of those graves have changed with new analyses, including osteological studies that have sometimes reclassified presumed female skeletons as male and vice versa. The shifting of sex identifications in the burial record is itself revelatory. It underscores the interpretive complexity of reading gender and status into bones. What remains clearer are cases from various parts of the Scandinavian world and the Kievan and Volga regions, where female skeletons appear with trauma suggestive of violent death, and where burial postures and associated goods imply servile or attendant roles. Across certain kurgan burials and mound interments, archaeologists have documented contexts where women are interred alongside male elites, occasionally with evidence interpreted as perimortem injuries that occurred around the time of death, and that may be consistent with strangulation, blunt force, or sharp force trauma. Forensic techniques have refined these readings in recent decades. Examination of cervical vertebrae can indicate compressive force consistent with strangulation. Cut marks, fractured bones, or other perimortem indicators can suggest violent intervention, and careful contextual analysis, examining articulation, burial position, and associated grave goods, helps distinguish ritual killing from death by other causes. Isotope and aDNA studies can further illuminate origins and mobility, showing whether individuals were local to the burial place or arrived from elsewhere. That kind of data sometimes supports the idea that those interred as attendants were not free wives or kin, but people of different geographic origin and possibly enslaved status. However, aDNA and isotope studies have limitations. They cannot reveal status directly. They can only indicate biological signatures, and they require cautious integration with material culture and written accounts. It is important to present both the confirmations and the caveats. On one hand, the convergence of textual descriptions like Ibn Fadlan's with archaeological finds, female bodies placed in close association with male elites, evidence of violent perimortem trauma, and the occurrence of ship burials lends weight to his account's wider plausibility. On the other hand, the archaeological record is patchy and regionally variable. Not every elite burial includes attendants. Not every site in the Viking world practiced human sacrifice, and the exact modalities of ritual, 10 days of feeding and passing, a doorway vision, an angel of death, cannot be reconstructed in every case from the soil alone. The best historical work, therefore, is comparative and conditional. It matches text to context, estimates prevalence conservatively, and notes regional and chronological change. Scholars have long debated how widespread the practice described by Ibn Fadlan was. One school of thought treats his report as indicative of an elite funerary rite present in certain social strata and certain regions, highly visible in contexts where elites sought to cement status through death spectacle. Another cautions against extrapolating a single account into a generalized model, reminding readers of the peril in treating dramatic descriptions as normative. These debates matter because how we estimate prevalence shapes broader narratives about Norse society. whether it was a culture regularly practicing ritual human sacrifice or one where such acts were exceptional and heavily localized. A related point concerns the chronological trajectory of such rites. The period in which Ibn Fadlan wrote, the early 10th century, coincides with ongoing social and religious flux in Scandinavia and among Norse communities abroad. Contact with Christian polities, conversion processes, and the institutional changes associated with Christianization over the following centuries altered funerary practice significantly. Many rites that involved grave goods, ship burials, and perhaps human attendance either changed form or fell out of ritual practice as Christian ideologies about death and burial took hold. By the 12th century in many regions, the Christian funerary logic prevailed, and the archaeological record shows different patterns: fewer ship burials, different grave goods, and a new emphasis on consecrated spaces. This diachronic change supports the idea that practices like those Ibn Fadlan recorded could be temporally bounded, possible in a particular window of history, concentrated among certain elites, and subsequently attenuated or suppressed. The processes of Christianization and centralization of power do not, however, explain away the human reality of what transpired. If anything, they foreground a moral question historians cannot ignore. What do we do with witnesses and victims when the record is fragmentary and the acts are abhorrent to modern sensibilities? Ibn Fadlan's account is valuable not only for its information, but for the ethical lens it forces us to adopt. He is a witness who names the actors, describes the spectacle, and refrains from inventing inner thoughts. Archaeologists, by recovering bones and treating them with scientific rigor, restore bodies to the archive of human lives. Together, their records allow us to name a pattern, that ritual and status sometimes required human attendance, and that slavery functioned within that logic to render certain people more available to such demands. The anonymity of victims like the slave girl, unnamed in the text, unmarked in the archaeological record beyond bone and burial position, is itself a moral locus. In the absence of a personal name, historians must resist the temptation to fill the gap with imagined interiority. Ethical narration requires us to honor the person as much as the evidence allows, to describe what was done to her, to situate those acts in systemic structures of power and belief, and to insist on the human dignity denied to her in life. Recounting the ritual with care and precision is a form of witnessing. It is a way to prevent erasure by making the mechanisms of disposability visible to modern readers. Comparative perspectives help frame interpretive possibilities without collapsing difference into equivalence. Human attendants accompanying the dead appear in many funerary traditions around the world and across time, from South Asian sati traditions to African and Native American variants, in which the household might be represented in death. Comparative anthropology shows that offering attendance to accompany the dead can serve manifold symbolic functions, affirming household integrity, preventing social disorder, communicating with ancestors, or fulfilling cosmological obligations. These comparative data are instructive but not determinative. They remind us that similar symbolic logics can take different forms, have different thresholds of consent, and carry different social meanings depending on local context. For the Viking and Rus worlds Ibn Fadlan observed, the specific configuration, 10 days of honor, followed by lethal sacrifice, a doorway vision, the role of an angel of death, is a historically situated phenomenon with its own internal logic. How do modern historians reconcile moral condemnation with contextualization? One approach is analytical sympathy, to understand the cultural logic without excusing the act. That means acknowledging sincerely held beliefs and social structures that made the ritual conceivable, while also naming it as a violation of bodily autonomy and dignity. It means seeing the perpetrators not simply as monsters, nor as unthinking automatons of belief, but as actors embedded in a moral universe where honor, obligation, and survival intersected in ways profoundly different from our own. It also requires us to emphasize structural explanations, slavery, power asymmetries, ritual authority, over an individualizing account that would reduce the episode to mere willful cruelty by particular men. A further layer of debate concerns the motivations of the slave girl herself. Ibn Fadlan records that she was treated as honored, and that some informants framed her participation as a form of devotion or duty. Modern readers may ask whether she volunteered or was coerced. The evidence does not allow a definitive answer. Slavery creates conditions in which consent is structurally compromised. Even the presentation of choice in such settings can be a form of coercion. The 10-day honor could be read as theatrical preparation designed to secure her acquiescence, or as a social mechanism that altered her perceptions through ritual intoxication. Either way, the notion of consent in that context must be approached with caution. Scholarship generally frames claims about her agency in probabilistic terms. It is possible she believed in the ritual's cosmological claims. It is likely she faced constrained options because of her status. It is also plausible she was subject to explicit force, as the doorway hesitation and the intervention of the angel of death suggest. Archaeological case studies help flesh out the broader picture. At certain mound cemeteries associated with Rus or Scandinavian elites, archaeologists have documented burial assemblages that include women whose skeletal remains show trauma consistent with violent death, sometimes arranged beside richer male burials. In other burials, the association is less obvious. Women present with male elites might be high-status companions rather than attendants. This variability highlights the need for careful local analysis. Moreover, innovations in forensic methodology, micro-CT scanning of bone, microscopic analysis of cut marks, biochemical signatures, have allowed more nuanced readings. For example, perimortem fractures of the cervical vertebrae can point toward violent strangulation. Cut marks on ribs or sternums can indicate stabbing-like interventions. Soft tissue injuries are less likely to leave durable traces, complicating matters where strangulation without apparent bony trauma occurred. Isotope data showing non-local origins help identify whether certain women came from different regions, perhaps indicating their status as captives or traded individuals. Yet these methods are not absolute. Taphonomic processes, excavation biases, and sampling limitations can render the archaeological record incomplete. Some scholars advocate treating Ibn Fadlan's account as emblematic of a wider ritual complex known from textual and comparative sources, while others argue for reading it as a particularized episode whose resemblance to other funerary contexts is partial. Both views can coexist if scholars are precise about scale and causality. The account should be valued for its vividness and specificity, but not extrapolated into claims of system-wide norms, absent broader corroboration. The ritual's decline with Christianization must be understood within the larger social transformations of the medieval North. As ecclesiastical structures spread, ruled by different cosmologies and ecclesial controls, practices that required human attendance became less defensible in the eyes of new moral authorities and new legal frameworks. Conversion processes often involved negotiation. Elites appropriated certain displays while abandoning others. Local customs were adapted or suppressed. The archaeological shifts reduced grave goods, altered burial orientations. The emergence of consecrated cemeteries mirror this cultural reconfiguration. Whether these transformations were primarily the result of ideological conversion, political centralization, or changing economic structures is a matter of scholarly debate. Likely, all those factors played a role. In any case, By the late medieval period, rituals like Ibn Fadlan recorded had become rare or transformed beyond easy recognition. Returning to the human scale of the story, the slave girl remains unnamed in both the ink of Ibn Fadlan and the dirt of the graveyards. Her anonymity is not merely historical inconvenience, it is part of the moral fabric of the account. To narrate her story responsibly is to resist erasure by restoring attention to her as a real person who was instrumentalized by social orders of power and belief. We can do this without inventing her inner life, by detailing the practices that governed her treatment, by explicating the social logics that rendered her expendable, and by making visible the mechanisms, shield beating, ritual formulae, specialist authority that facilitated her death. Witnessing, in that sense, is a moral act. It refuses the tidy erasure of the individual in favor of a durably recorded injustice. What finally makes the title apt, the phrasing, passing her around before the fire, it captures a paradox. The woman was, in the ritual logic, both honored and circulated. She was both personified in ritual speech and objectified as provision. The phrase foregrounds a single act, being passed, that encapsulates the entanglement of devotion, domination, and spectacle. To pass someone in ritual is to move them through social relations as a material of exchange, tent to tent, man to man, declaration to declaration, until the fire completes the transition. This movement is what makes the scene disturbing in a particular register, not simply the killing, but the routinized choreography that made killing a public, performative, and institutionally validated act. The story also underscores the fragile relationship between witness and memory. Without Ibn Fadlan's report, this specific ritual might have remained invisible to later readers. Without archaeological corroboration, his account could have been dismissed as exaggeration. The pairing of text and soil produces a clearer, though not perfect, picture. It allows us to see both the mechanics and the meanings of a practice that turned a human life into ritual provision. In closing, the account invites reflection on broader issues that still resonate. Rituals of death are, anthropologically speaking, mirrors of social structure. They reveal what a society values, whom it counts as kin, and whom it designates as expendable. They expose the mechanisms by which communities maintain cohesion in the face of loss, and how they translate metaphysical beliefs into corporal practice. The passing of a woman before a fire on the banks of the Volga in 921 is therefore not merely an isolated horror, it is a window into a cultural horizon where honor, obligation, and hierarchy intersected to produce acts modern readers find difficult to reconcile with human dignity. That difficulty should not obscure rigorous historical work. We must continue to read texts critically, excavate carefully, apply new forensic methods judiciously, and debate prevalence and meaning with evidentiary humility. We must also cultivate an ethical posture that keeps victims like the unnamed slave girl at the center of inquiry while refusing to reduce them to symbols. Remembering her involves naming the mechanics that ended her life, the rituals, the roles, the shields beating to mute cries, the rope and the blade that ended the scene before flames consumed the ship. It involves acknowledging the social conditions, slavery, elite display, ritual authority that made such an act possible. And it involves insisting that archaeological fragments and inked pages together can restore a measure of historical presence to lives otherwise erased. If this account has unsettled you, that response is appropriate. The past can trouble our moral equilibrium precisely because it refuses to conform to present norms. Share that feeling, discuss it, and consider that history's task is not merely to titillate with strange customs, but to illuminate the moral contours of human societies, how they bind, how they break, and how they remember. Tell us where you're watching from in the comments, and share this if you believe these anonymous lives deserve to be remembered.